Okay, good morning. Can you hear me okay, Orli?
I can. Good morning.
All right. On behalf of Gender Ideal, welcome everyone. I'm Flori Wilson, the founder and CEO of Gender Ideal, and I'm delighted to have you join us. Hey, good morning. Can you hear me okay, Orli?
I can. Good morning.
Okay. Technical difficulty there. Orli, are you? Can you still hear me okay?
I can hear you. Yeah.
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 You can hear me? Okay. I was getting a little feedback there. We're delighted to have you all joining us for the second of 10 LinkedIn Live sessions that we have planned. This series explores the concepts covered in the Ideal 12 assessment. We hope that you will walk away from each conversation with the insight you need to be an advocate inside of your organization regarding why and how to begin the implementation of these practices. Links to this video and all of the other interviews that we're holding as part of this series and additional resources can be found on the resources page of our website. And the series supports the Ideal 12 campaign, which Gender Ideal launched in March of 2022, which is designed to be a first step for companies to benchmark their performance on 12 core practices that have impact on gender equity in the workplace. We encourage everyone on this call or watching the video participate in taking the Ideal 12 on behalf of your organization. Upon submission of the Ideal 12 assessment, companies receive a score out of 12 possible points. They have access to a benchmark report and are encouraged to either commit to making progress on the Ideal 12 topics, or for those companies that score high, meaning close to those full 12 points, we encourage them to take the full Gender Ideal assessment, which also is on the Gender Ideal website. You can learn more at www.gender-ideal.org. One more note before we jump in, we want this to be useful and interactive for our audience, so we encourage you to use the comment section and to ask questions and add to the dialogue. And we'll reserve a few minutes at the end for Q&A. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Orli Cotel. Orli is part of the founding team at the National Nonprofit Paid Leave for the U.S., or PLUS for short. PLUS has helped win paid leave for over 8 million workers in the United States at companies like Walmart, Starbucks, CVS, and many others. And they've channeled that momentum into the fight for national legislation that would bring paid leave to everyone in the United States. As senior advisor and former VP of partnerships at PLUS, Orli has helped advise companies like Postmates, Thumbtack, Sun Life Financial, and more on designing and launching equitable and inclusive paid family leave policies. She has been working at the center of this topic during a period of rapid evolution and progress on it. And so let's go ahead and dig in. Orli, let's start by talking about the current corporate paid leave landscape. So who currently has access to paid leave, who doesn't, and how have things changed in the last couple of years?
Well, thanks so much, first of all, for having me on today. You know, I'm thrilled to talk about this topic, and I think one of the things that makes this so timely is the momentum that we're seeing, especially from the private sector. When we started our work at PLUS, when we launched, paid leave was still largely considered a very elite benefit. So 5 years ago, when we began our work, paid leave was something you might find in some tech companies or in finance. It was largely a benefit for executives and managers. It was not something that most people had, and especially low-wage working people. And so we started our work with an equity lens because we really wanted to catalyze a change in that landscape so that paid leave would be something that was seen as necessary to provide to all working people and not just folks that could have it as an elite benefit. Because we really don't think it should be a perk to be able to be there for your family in the most important moments of your life. That is something that actually everyone deserves. And you know, as we started that work, we have seen a tectonic shift in that life. So I would say that now it is becoming much more common for workplaces to provide paid leave. And in fact, it's something that employees are demanding. I think we'll get into that a little bit more later. But I do want to ground the conversation in the fact that while that shift is currently happening, there are still 100 million people who don't have any paid leave. And I want to let that number sink in. 100 million people who don't have a single day of paid leave. And one pitfall of this work is to get caught up in the statistics and forget that each of those people is a real human. So I like to start with a story about what this actually means. I did a call recently with a nurse who is a NICU nurse. So she works in the neonatal intensive care unit with the most vulnerable infants, newborns. And she told me it's very common for her patients to not have any paid leave at all. And that recently she had a mom who came in, gave birth on a Wednesday, put her baby in the NICU, and she was back at her job as a server at Waffle House that weekend. The nurse told me that that mom would every day after her shift, after her long day of work, and she would sit with her baby in the hospital and she would just cry. And that was her routine. Go to her day at work, come to the NICU and cry next to her infant who needed her. And that's because there are so many workplaces that are still failing the folks who work there, and because our national public policy landscape hasn't yet met the need of American families. So that's what it means to not have paid leave in this country. And I'm thrilled that so many folks on this call want to know how to do better at their companies, because the good news is lots of companies have adopted great new policies. And so there are many models to follow for how you can do right by your employees and also reap the benefits, because this isn't just good for employees. As you'll see from the companies that are doing it, it's very good for their business model as well.
Thank you for kind of framing out the issue and highlighting how many people still don't have access to what really feels like a very kind of fundamental benefit. Before I go any further, I want to kind of get a little bit into terminology. So I know when I had my first child, who is now 9 years old, I had maternity leave. And I was really lucky to have maternity leave. I got 12 weeks of paid leave, which was great, a great benefit and an unusual benefit at the time. But now, as I read about this topic, it feels like maternity leave and paternity leave are kind of like out of fashion. I hear more about family leave. During the pandemic, I've heard more folks talking about caregiver leave. Can you just break down the terminology for us and let us know, like, what are the different types of leave and then what are we focused on in this conversation?
Yeah, so I think when companies began providing leave, one of the first types of leave that was provided was maternity leave for women who had given birth, who needed to recover from childbirth. Companies are moving in a different direction, and I think that's because there's a growing awareness of the fact that if you only provide maternity leave, you're signaling to your employees and your customers and the world that parenting is a woman's responsibility, which is really an outdated notion that's really no longer acceptable in the world that we live in, especially for workplaces that want to commit to gender equity. And I think a lot about a quote by Anne-Marie Slaughter, who says, and I'm not going to get this exactly right, but something along the lines of, you can't have equality for women in the workplace if you don't also have equality for men at home. And so a lot of workplaces are realizing that if you signal to women from the very beginning that it's their job to do childcare, that impacts their family dynamic, and that also impacts their ability to deliver as an employee. And it impacts the way your whole workplace is approaching the idea of working families. And so more workplaces are now following the lead of companies that have said, we're going to have a gender neutral policy. It's going to be a parental leave policy, which also, frankly, is much more inclusive to adoptive parents. Everybody has the same kind of journey to become a parent. And if you have a policy that's only for parents who give birth, you're leaving out all of the adoptive and parents in your workplace. So that kind of equal dynamic for parental leave is very important. And that's part of the terminology around parental leave. The caregiving leave terminology is because more and more workplaces are recognizing that people have all kinds of caregiving responsibilities that aren't just for newborns. So especially aging population in our country, a lot of folks have to care for their parents, or they may have to care for a spouse with cancer. They may have to care for a family member who's in a car accident. All kinds of things happen in our lives, and you need to be able to show up for your family, or you can't show up at work. And so Deloitte really pioneered this idea of leave that would be not just gender neutral, but also what they were calling generational neutral, that folks who can take up to 16 weeks of leave in a calendar year for any caregiving emergency that they have. So that could be welcoming a baby, it could be caring for an aging parent, it could be a family member with cancer. All of those things are combined. So that's what caregiving leave means. It kind of goes beyond parental leave and includes all of those family needs that might come up.
Great. That's very, very helpful. Thank you for that. And I like that emphasis on non-gender specific leave and then the cross-generational leave as well. That's a new term or a new way of thinking about this topic for me. So let's get into some more details. Can you tell us why companies should care about providing paid leave to their employees? You started to mention this a little bit at the top of our conversation, but let's dig into the business case for paid comprehensive leave.
Yeah, so I'll just start by saying, in our work at Plus, I work with over 300 companies that all advocate for paid leave. And they all have to make a profit. They're all in this because they want to be a mission-driven business, but they're a business at the end of the day. And I think what's so exciting about paid leave as a benefit is that it really helps employees and families, but it also does help the bottom line of the companies that do the right thing. And the more ambitious you can be, the more far-reaching your paid leave program can be, the more benefits you will see as an employer. So I think there are a few areas where the companies we work with really see the strongest return on that investment: recruitment, retention, and morale. So right now, especially, we're in the middle of the Great Resignation. We've seen over 2 million leave the workplace during COVID. Recruitment needs are very high, and it's very hard to attract the right talent. And the companies that have excellent paid leave have found that it really does help with recruitment, not only with women, but millennial men want to be involved dads. I could tell you many personal stories, anecdotes of men that I know that have come to us and have said, I'm looking for a new job. How do I find out who has great paternity leave? It's something I want to know about. So that it is important for recruiting the talent that you want for your company. And then for retention, you see a really large return on investment. And this isn't just anecdotal, there's real data to back this up. When Google expanded their paid leave policy to offer longer maternity leaves, this was a number of years ago when folks were still doing maternity instead of parental. But when they expanded that maternity leave, they saw a reduction of 50% in the number of women who quit. So that's a huge benefit to your retention of employees. People that you've trained, you've gone to the effort to recruit them, train them, bring them up that leadership ladder, get them to be really great at their jobs. That's the moment when you don't want to lose them. And so by giving them actually more time off, they come back from that leave and are more invested as employees and stick around. So I'll stop there, but those are just some of the benefits that we see. And actually, I will add, we have on our website, if you go to paidleave.us, we have a cost benefit calculator that we've created. I think too often folks think only about the expense of the paid leave program. How many dollars will this cost me in the first year that I implement it? And they don't also look at the numbers of the return on that investment. How much will you save in your recruitment and in your employee retention? So we've built out a calculator for folks. It's an Excel calculator that helps you figure out those exact numbers, and it'll show you how much you'll save by creating a better program.
That's awesome. And I'm glad you mentioned the calculator. We'll be sure to link to that as well. But I do think, as you said, there's a compelling business case here. And I think if your organization has helped to empower employees to advocate for this work, doing it in true financial terms is a really powerful way to approach the issue. So, okay, let's talk then about what are some of the best-in-class leave policies today for workplaces. What is kind of the norm? What do employees increasingly expect? What are the components of those leave policies? If you can tell us more about that.
Yeah. Well, I think sometimes sharing examples is the most helpful. Deloitte is one that I bring up again and again because they were really pioneers in figuring out this idea of a paid leave policy that would be equal for all employees, not only for new parents, but for folks that had any kind of caregiving responsibilities. And so they led the way with that, and a lot of other companies have followed suit in terms of what employees actually need. So the first thing is you have to make sure that your policy is equal for all employees. That means it's not a different amount of weeks or different kind of benefit for managers. It applies to salaried, hourly, full-time, part-time. People's employee status does not change how much they need to be there for their families. So we really need to look at this as, how do we serve our employees in a way that makes all of them feel seen, feel cared for as employees, and feel part of the community at our workplace. And so that also means making sure that you're not prescribing what a family should look like, that you're recognizing that families come in all shapes and sizes. So one of the ways that we've seen that show up in people's policies is making sure that your policy applies to adoptive parents, foster parents, different journeys to become parents. And that we've seen companies that we've advised, like Sun Life Financial, have a definition of family that includes chosen family. So what that means is, if you're going to do a caregiving policy and say you can help someone through surgery, you don't want to say in your policy, this only means your parents and your spouse. Many people have responsibilities to care for a sibling, and many people, frankly, have responsibilities to care for someone who may not be related to them by blood, but is family to them, a roommate for whom they are the only system of support. So all of these different aspects come together in saying everyone in your company should have an equal policy, and all means all. I'll also say, when we talked about terminology earlier, a lot of companies moved away from the idea of maternity or paternity leave and started talking about leave as primary and secondary caregiver leave. At the time, they thought that was really progressive because it was gender neutral, and it for LGBTQ families in which there might be two dads to still say, somebody would get the longer length of leave. We find this very problematic because if you're asking employees to make a choice in their family in the early days of forming their new family, to say who's going to be the primary caregiver, that creates a gender dynamic that really is not aligned with the equality and the equity that we want to see in our society, in our families, and in our workplaces. And so you don't want to have to make your employees choose who's going to do more parenting. People want to be equal parents. So get rid of that terminology. And it also opens you up to lawsuits. JP Morgan had a very intense lawsuit because of the unequal implementation of their policy around primary and secondary caregiver. I could tell you all about that, but I'll stop there and see what kind of follow-up questions you have.
Well, I'm glad you made that specific reference to the primary, secondary caregiver, because I'll confess that on the gender ideal assessment, we ask folks to report on what % of employees that are primary caregivers or secondary caregivers utilize their leave policy. So we've got some updates that we need to make. So I'm glad to know that. One thing, I could imagine that as a company is trying to put into place such a comprehensive policy, right, that includes salaried but also hourly workers, part-time, et cetera, they might say, well, we want to only provide this benefit to employees that we've already made the investment in training, or that we know are going to commit to the organization. So is there what guidance do you provide if a company says, look, we'll put this really comprehensive policy in place, but we only want it to be available to employees that have worked here for a year or 6 months? Like, how would you respond to that? What is the best practice in terms of when someone can have access to these comprehensive plans?
Look, companies do all kinds of different, I've seen every different method of doing it. I've seen companies say you have to be here a year, you have to be here 6 months. But overall, I think the most important thing is just to say, how do we want to show up for our employees, and how do we want them to show up for us? Because I have seen so many LinkedIn posts from people. Even yesterday, I just saw this amazing LinkedIn post from a woman who said, I interviewed for this job and I was very upfront to tell the company that I was 9 months pregnant. through the whole process. They wanted me, they hired me anyway, and I was able to take leave after I had been in the job for only a few weeks, right? I started for a few weeks, I went out on leave, and I came back, and I am so proud of this company. I'm thrilled to work there. Her morale was, better than it possibly could have been anywhere else. So I think that the point is, do the best that you can do for your employees, and you will see the benefits. When I think about the best-in-class policies, I wanted to share a couple of other things. I think there's a misperception that only a large company can afford to have a great policy, or that if you're a startup, you have to wait until you're bigger to provide a great policy. And that's not the case. I want to provide two really strong examples. One is what we do at Plus, at Paid Leave for the US. So what we had, I think, under 10 employees when my second child was born, and I went out for 6 months of paid leave. And I came back a better, more dedicated, and happier employee at the organization. So we're a nonprofit, we're a small organization, and we provide 6 months of paid leave to all of our employees. Bobby, which is an organic infant formula company, just publicly shared their policy, which is that they have 56 employees, I think. They have under 100 employees. And their policy is 4 months of fully paid parental leave, followed by up to 8 months of unpaid leave. So you can be out for a year and come back and get your job back. And they're doing that as a small employer that's a growing startup. And so I think that just really shows that companies of all sizes can do this, and that they do see the benefits from it.
I love that Bobby example. I read about that as well. And it's also maybe worth mentioning, there's been a movement in the last couple of months, and I'm blanking on the name of the organization behind it, but this hashtag Show Us Your Leave, where they're encouraging
the Skin, the media company. Yeah.
Right, that's right. They've had over 300 companies kind of participate in this by publicly posting their leave policies, and encouraging transparency around these things, I think, is incredibly important, so that employees during the recruitment process feel comfortable asking, what is the leave plan, if it's not already publicly posted. And it's all very important in having free access to information. Okay, so let's talk about Plus. This organization, when you and I first connected, my jaw hit the ground when I realized how integral you and your colleagues have been in passing or implementing leave policies at some of the biggest companies around the globe, and you've done it quietly. So tell us about your work and the long-term vision of Plus.
Yeah, and I will say, when you say we've done the work quietly, part of it is that we really look at our work through the lens of how can we do things that are high impact and low ego. So it hasn't been about brand building for our organization. It's really been about a lot of work that we can do behind the scenes to really create that shift in the landscape. When we started our work, we realized that paid leave really was non-existent at most of the large employers, the largest employers in the country, for their low-wage working staff. So, for example, right around the time we launched, Starbucks announced this great paid leave policy. They were praised in the media for it. No reporters were asking them the question, who does it actually apply to? When we asked that question, we saw that the policy that they announced was for their 3,000 employees in their corporate headquarters, and completely left out the 160,000 baristas that are really the heart and soul of their operation. So that was when we decided to help transform the policies at Starbucks, Walmart, CVS. We were really working with all of these companies to try to get them to change their policies. And we were able to effectively have them update their policies so that about 8 million people at those companies, and then other companies that had kind of a trickle-down effect, were able to get paid leave because of that change in the private sector. I will say that that what we needed to do was to change the private sector, but we also took all of that momentum and tried to channel that into the fight to pass federal paid leave policy. Because what we really need is not just for employers to do their part, but for the federal government to pass paid leave. There are 10 states now and DC that have passed paid leave programs in their states, but one national federal program would really bring paid leave. When we talked earlier about those 100 million people who don't have paid leave. The way that's going to happen is going to be when we pass a national program.
And I just wanted to ask one clarification when you talked about Starbucks and Walmart. So are all of the employees, whether they're hourly or salaried at organizations like that, now able to access the same leave policies, or is there still some kind of difference in the amount of benefit or the number paid?
No, they still have, those companies have a ways to go. So they have taken steps to make, for example, Walmart, when we started our work, their hourly associates had no paid leave. So we worked to get paid leave for hourly associates at Walmart. However, Walmart only gave those benefits to their full-time staff. And there are, I believe that was how it played out. And so, there are hundreds of thousands of people who work part-time at Walmart, often not by choice. They would like to have more hours, but they're not given enough hours to meet that benefits threshold. So there's a long way to go. Yeah, we're seeing progress, but there's more that needs to be done. I will say that this is one of the reasons why we need federal policy to streamline what's available to folks. And that we've seen California's had a statewide paid leave policy in California, which means that it's funded by the state. It takes it off of the employer's balance sheet so that, especially for small business, like I live in California, work for a small nonprofit at Paid Leave for the US. When I took leave, I would get a check from the state for a percentage of my salary for that time. And then my employer only had to pay a small amount to top up and make sure I was 100% paid. So it provides a lot of help to employers as well.
Great. We have less than 5 minutes left. I have a few more questions. I'm enjoying this conversation so much. So it sounds like in your role, you have worked with employers, right? So I'm going to assume that those employers, management at those companies have invited you in because they've already made the decision that they want to do better on their leave policies. What advice would you give to people who are on this call who maybe aren't in that management role or who aren't the decision makers, but who want to advocate internally within their organizations? How should they approach this? You've mentioned a couple of the resources that are on your website, but if there are other things, case studies, et cetera, if you could share your thoughts on that, that would be helpful.
Yeah, we have two different sets of resources on our website. We have resources that are geared more towards employers, and we have internal advocacy materials for employees who want to help advocate for better leave at their own companies. And I'll also say what you mentioned from the SKIM, the Show Us Your Leave campaign, they've recently launched a database of all of the 400 companies that have shared their policies. And so if you go to the SKIM's website and look for that database, it's really helpful for benchmarking. If you can bring your HR department some benchmarking data that shows how your competitors are doing better on paid leave, that really helps companies to update their policies. And I do want to add one more quick thing, which is when we talk about what makes a great paid leave policy, we've talked about it being equal, we've talked about some of the terminology, and we have sample policies on our website that you can borrow. The policy that I mentioned from Bobby, the formula company, they have a whole handbook that they've just launched that shows you their full policy. They say, I think they're calling it Take Our Leave, take their policy, use their language. But the last thing I want to mention is that we're finding more and more companies are seeing it's not enough to only have your own great paid leave policy. You also need to take a stand in support of public policy for paid leave. And that's not only because it will help business and help your bottom line to have the government subsidizing the cost of the leave through a federal or a state program, but also because your consumers care about this issue. Many of them don't have paid leave. And so for everyone who's marketing to millennials, which is everybody almost, this is an issue where if you raise your hand as a company and say, we do the right thing for our employees, and we also want to advocate for paid leave for everyone in the US, we have 350 companies that have done that on our website by saying that they support public policy. So feel free to reach out to us at paidleave.us if you want to get involved in that work and have some opportunities for us to shine a spotlight on your leadership. And you don't have to have your own policy be perfect in order to advocate for federal paid leave for everyone, people at all stages of this process are raising their hand and saying, having federal paid leave would help us do better as a company. So I'll stop there, but happy to follow up with anyone who's interested in learning more.
No, I love it, Orli. And actually, my last question was going to be around advocacy, but maybe instead I'll just ask one specific question again. You have mentioned already one of the pieces of feedback that we hear often from the companies that are using our tools is just, oh, we haven't gotten to developing these policies yet. We're a little too small. We're a little too early stage. How small? Do you know what is the smallest company that has shared their leave policy either on your website or on the skim, just so if you're working at organizations with 20 or so employees know that there may be leave policies that they can kind of leverage internally. Do you have a sense for how small some of these companies are?
We launched our paid leave policy as a nonprofit when we had 5 employees.
Perfect.
So
okay.
I would say don't wait until you have your first crisis employee coming to you and saying, I'm pregnant. Have that policy set beforehand, because you're not going to want to scramble. And frankly, it's really hard to ad-lib it when someone has a family health crisis. Even if you think you don't have any employees that are planning to start families, someone can get into a car accident or get a medical diagnosis any day. And it's good to have a plan in place for how you can handle that. And if you live in one of the 10 states that provides paid leave, they help cover the costs not only of parental leave, but of medical leave, family caregiving, all of those other options. So it's good to get up to speed on what your, what your financial responsibility might be, because it may be far less than you're anticipating. If you live in New York, California, Massachusetts, Seattle, Colorado, there's many of the states where the companies on this call are operating already have that support from the state if they know to look for it.
That's so helpful. Orli, it has been such a pleasure to talk with you about this today. I'm really, you're such a wealth of information. I have learned a lot from this conversation. I think everyone who watches this video as well, I'm sure has learned a lot. We will be posting this, and we will also be following up with all of the resources that Orli has mentioned during the call. So thank you so much for your time and for the incredible work that you have done on this very impactful topic.
And thank you for your leadership and for having this conversation. Really enjoyed talking with you today.
Great. All right. Have a great day. Thanks, everyone, for joining.